Chapter 11 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan, Montreal, May 2007. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 11. The Famous Fellowship of Fairies. After a short walk through very beautiful gardens, they came to the castle and followed Tubekins through the entrance and into a great domed chamber, where he commanded them to be seated. From the crown which he wore, Betsy had thought this man must be the king of the country they were in. Yet after he had seated all the strangers upon the benches that were ranged in a semicircle before a high throne, Tubekins bowed humbly before the vacant throne, and in a flash became invisible and disappeared. The hall was an immense place, but there seemed to be no one in it beside themselves. Presently, however, they heard a low cough near them, and here and there was the faint rustling of a robe, and a slight patter as of footsteps. Then suddenly there rang out the clear tone of a bell, and at the sound all was changed. Gazing around the hall in bewilderment, they saw that it was filled with hundreds of men and women, all with beautiful faces and staring blue eyes, and all wearing scarlet robes and jeweled crowns upon their heads. In fact, these people seemed exact duplicates of Tubekins, and it was difficult to find any mark by which to tell them apart. "My, what a lot of kings and queens!" whispered Betsy to Polychrome, who sat beside her and appeared much interested in the scene, but not a bit worried. "It is certainly a strange sight," was Polychrome's reply. "But I cannot see how there can be more than one king or queen in any one country, for were these all rulers, no one could tell who was the master." One of the kings who stood near and overheard this remark turned to her and said, "One who is master of himself is always a king, if only to himself. In this favored land all kings and queens are equal, and it is our privilege to bow before one supreme ruler, the private citizen." "Who's he?" inquired Betsy. As if to answer her, the clear tones of the bell again rang out, and instantly there appeared seated in the throne the man who was lord and master of all these royal ones. This fact was evident when with one accord they fell upon their knees and touched their foreheads to the floor. Private Citizen was not unlike the others, except that his eyes were black instead of blue, and in the centres of the black irises glowed red sparks that seemed like coals of fire. But his features were very beautiful and dignified, and his manner composed and stately. Instead of the prevalent scarlet robe, he wore one of white, and the same dragon's head that decorated the others was embroidered upon its bosom. "What charge lies against these people, Tubekins?" he asked in quiet, even tones. "They came through the forbidden tube, O mighty citizen," was the reply. "You see, it was this way," said Betsy. "We were marching to the Gnome King to conquer him and set Shaggy's brother free, when on a sudden—" "Who are you?" demanded the private citizen sternly. "Me? Oh, I'm Betsy Bobbin, and—" "Who is the leader of this party?" asked the citizen. "Sir, I am Queen Ann of Oogaboo, and—" "Then keep quiet," said the citizen. "Who is the leader?" No one answered for a moment. Then General Bun stood up. "Sit down," commanded the citizen. "I can see that 16 of you are merely officers and of no account." "But we have an army," said General Clog blusteringly, for he didn't like to be told he was of no account. "Where is your army?" asked the citizen. "It's me," said Tik-Tok, his voice sounding a little rusty. "I'm the only private soldier in the party." Hearing this, the citizen rose and bowed respectfully to the Clockwork Man. "Pardon me for not realizing your importance before," said he. "Will you oblige me by taking a seat beside me on my throne?" Tik-Tok rose and walked over to the throne, all the kings and queens making way for him. Then with clanking steps he mounted the platform and sat on the broad seat beside the citizen. Anne was greatly provoked at this mark of favor shown to the humble Clockwork Man, but Shaggy seemed much pleased that his old friend's importance had been recognized by the ruler of this remarkable country. The citizen now began to question Tik-Tok, who told in his mechanical voice about Shaggy's quest and of his lost brother, and how Ozma of Oz had sent the Clockwork Man to assist him, and how they had fallen in with Queen Anne and her people from Oogaboo. Also he told how Betsy and Hank and Polychrome and the Rose Princess had happened to join their party. "And you intended to conquer Ruggedo, the Metal Monarch and King of the Gnomes?" asked the citizen. "Yes, that seemed the only thing for us to do," was Tik-Tok's reply. "But he was too clever for us. When we got close to his cavern he made our path lead to the tube, and made the opening invisible, so that we all fell into it before we knew it was there. It was an easy way to get rid of us, and now Ruggedo is safe and we are far away in a strange land." The citizen was silent a moment, and seemed to be thinking. Then he said, "Most noble private soldier, I must inform you that by the laws of our country anyone who comes through the forbidden tube must be tortured for 9 days and 10 nights, and then thrown back into the tube. But it is wise to disregard laws when they conflict with justice, and it seems that you and your followers did not disobey our laws willingly, being forced into the tube by Ruggedo. Therefore the Gnome King is alone to blame, and he alone must be punished." "That suits me," said Tik-Tok. "But Ruggedo is on the other side of the world, where he is a way out of your reach." The citizen drew himself up proudly. "Do you imagine anything in the world or upon it can be out of the reach of the great Jin-Jin?" he asked. "Oh, are you then the great Jin-Jin?" inquired Tik-Tok. "I am." "Then your name is Titi-Hoo-Choo?" "It is." Queen Anne gave a scream and began to tremble. Shaggy was so disturbed that he took out a handkerchief and wiped the perspiration from his brow. Polychrome looked sober and uneasy for the first time, while Fowls put his arm around the Rose Princess as if to protect her. As for the officers, the name of the great Jin-Jin set them moaning and weeping at a great rate, and everyone fell upon his knees before the throne, begging for mercy. Betsy was worried at seeing her companions so disturbed, but did not know what it was all about. Only Tik-Tok was unmoved at the discovery. "Then," said he, "if you are Titi-Hoo-Choo and think Ruggedo is to blame, I am sure that something queer will happen to the King of the Gnomes." "I wonder what will be," said Betsy. The private citizen, otherwise known as Titi-Hoo-Choo, the great Jin-Jin, looked at the little girl steadily. "I will presently decide what is to happen to Ruggedo," said he in a hard, stern voice. Then, turning to the throng of kings and queens, he continued, "Tik-Tok has spoken truly, for his machinery will not allow him to lie, nor will it allow his thoughts to think falsely. Therefore these people are not our enemies, and must be treated with consideration and justice. Take them to your palaces and entertain them as guests until tomorrow, when I command that they be brought again to my residence. By then I shall have formed my plans." No sooner had Titi-Hoo-Choo spoken than he disappeared from sight. Immediately after, most of the kings and queens likewise disappeared, but several of them remained visible and approached the strangers with great respect. One of the lovely queens said to Betsy, "I trust you will honor me by being my guest. I am Irma, Queen of Light." "May Hank come with me?" asked the girl. "The King of Animals will care for your mule," was the reply. "But do not fear for him, for he will be treated royally. All of your party will be reunited on the morrow." I'd like to have someone with me," said Betsy pleadingly. Queen Irma looked around and smiled upon Polychrome. "Will the Rainbow's Daughter be an agreeable companion?" she asked. "Oh, yes!" exclaimed the girl. So Polychrome and Betsy became guests of the Queen of Light, while the other beautiful kings and queens took charge of the others of the party. The two girls followed Irma out of the hall and through the gardens of the residence to a village of pretty dwellings. None of these was so large or imposing as the castle of the private citizen, but all were handsome enough to be called palaces, as in fact they really were. End of Chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 12. The Lovely Lady of Light. The palace of the Queen of Light stood on a little eminence and was a mass of crystal windows, surmounted by a vast crystal dome. When they entered the portals, Irma was greeted by 6 lovely maidens, evidently of high degree, who had once aroused Betsy's admiration. Each bore a wand in her hand, tipped with an emblem of light, and their costumes were also emblematic of the lights they represented. Irma introduced them to her guests, and each made a graceful and courteous acknowledgment. First was Sunlight, radiantly beautiful and very fair. The second was Moonlight, a soft, dreamy damsel with nut-brown hair. Next came Starlight, equally lovely, but inclined to be retiring and shy. These 3 were dressed in shimmering robes of silvery white. The fourth was Daylight, a brilliant damsel with laughing eyes and frank manners, who wore a variety of colors. Then came Firelight, clothed in a fleecy, flame-colored robe that wavered around her shapely form in a very attractive manner. The 6th maiden, Electra, was the most beautiful of all, and Betsy thought from the first that both Sunlight and Daylight regarded Electra with envy and were a little jealous of her. But all were cordial in their greetings to the strangers, and seemed to regard the Queen of Light with much affection, for they fluttered around her in a flashing, radiant group, as she led the way to her regal drawing-room. This apartment was richly and cosily furnished, the upholstery being of many tints, and both Betsy and Polychrome enjoyed resting themselves upon the downy divans after their strenuous adventure of the day. The Queen sat down to chat with her guests, who noticed that Daylight was the only maiden now seated beside Irma. The others had retired to another part of the room, where they sat modestly with entwined arms, and did not intrude themselves at all. The Queen told the strangers all about this beautiful land, which is one of the chief residences of fairies who minister to the needs of mankind. So many important fairies lived there that, to avoid rivalry, they had elected as their ruler the only important personage in the country who had no duties to mankind to perform, and was, in effect, a private citizen. This ruler, or Jin, as was his title, bore the name of Tititi-Hoochoo, and the most singular thing about him was that he had no heart. But instead of this he possessed a high degree of reason and justice, and while he showed no mercy in his judgments, he never punished unjustly or without reason. To wrongdoers, Tititi-Hoochoo was as terrible as he was heartless, but those who were innocent of evil had nothing to fear from him. All the kings and queens of this fairyland paid reverence to Jin, for as they expected to be obeyed by others, they were willing to obey the one in authority over them. The inhabitants of the land of Oz had heard many tales of this fearfully just Jin, whose punishments were always equal to the faults committed. Polychrome also knew of him, although this was the first time she had ever seen him face to face. But to Betsy the story was all new, and she was greatly interested in Tititi-Hoochoo, whom she no longer feared. Time sped swiftly during their talk, and suddenly Betsy noticed that Moonlight was sitting beside the Queen of Light instead of Daylight. "But tell me, please," she pleaded, "why do you all wear a dragon's head embroidered on your gowns?" Irma's pleasant face became grave as she answered, "The dragon, as you must know, was the first living creature ever made. Therefore the dragon is the oldest and wisest of living things. By good fortune, the original dragon, who still lives, is a resident of this land, and supplies us with wisdom whenever we are in need of it. He is old as the world, and remembers everything that has happened since the world was created." "Did he ever have any children?" inquired the girl. "Yes, many of them. Some wandered into other lands, where men, not understanding them, made war upon them. But many still reside in this country. None, however, is as wise as the original dragon, for whom we have great respect. As he was the first resident here, we wear the emblem of the dragon's head, to show that we are the favored people who alone have the right to inhabit this fairyland, which in beauty almost equals the fairyland of Oz, and in power quite surpasses it." "I understand about the dragon now," said Polychrome, nodding her lovely head. Betsy did not quite understand, but she was at present interested in observing the changing lights. As daylight had given way to moonlight, so now starlight sat at the right hand of Irma the Queen, and with her coming a spirit of peace and content seemed to fill the room. Polychrome, being herself a fairy, had many questions to ask about the various kings and queens who lived in this far-away, secluded place, and before Irma had finished answering them, a rosy glow filled the room, and firelight took her place beside the Queen. Betsy liked firelight, but to gaze upon her warm and glowing features made the little girl sleepy, and presently she began to nod. Thereupon Irma rose and took Betsy's hand gently in her own. "Come," said she, "the feast time has arrived, and the feast is spread." "That's nice," exclaimed the small mortal. "Now that I think of it, I'm awful hungry, but perhaps I can't eat your fairy food." The Queen smiled and led her to a doorway. As she pushed aside a heavy drapery, a flood of silvery light greeted them, and Betsy saw before her a splendid banquet hall, with a table spread with snowy linen and crystal and silver. At one side was a broad, throne-like seat for Irma, and beside her now sat the brilliant maid Electra. Polychrome was placed on the Queen's right hand, and Betsy upon her left. The other 5 messengers of light now waited upon them, and each person was supplied with just the food she liked best. Polychrome found her dish of dewdrops, all fresh and sparkling, while Betsy was so lavishly served that she decided she had never in her life eaten a dinner half so good. "I suppose," she said to the Queen, "that Miss Electra is the youngest of all these girls." "Why do you suppose that?" inquired Irma with a smile. "'Cause electricity's the newest light we know of. Didn't Mr. Edison discover it?" "Perhaps he was the first mortal to discover it," replied the Queen. "But electricity was a part of the world from its creation, and therefore my Electra is as old as daylight or moonlight, and equally beneficent to mortals and fairies alike." Betsy was thoughtful for a time. Then she remarked, as she looked at the 6 messengers of light, "We couldn't very well do without any of 'em, could we?" Irma laughed softly. "I couldn't, I'm sure," she replied, "and I think mortals would miss any one of my maidens as well. Daylight cannot take the place of sunlight, which gives us strength and energy. Moonlight is of value when daylight, worn out with her long watch, retires to rest. If the moon in its course is hidden behind the earth's rim, and my sweet moonlight cannot cheer us, starlight takes her place, for the skies always lend her power. Without firelight we should miss much of our warmth and comfort, as well as much cheer when the walls of houses encompass us. But always, when other lights forsake us, our glorious Electra is ready to flood us with bright rays. As Queen of Light, I love all my maidens, for I know them to be faithful and true." "I love 'em all, too," declared Betsy. "But sometimes, when I'm real sleepy, I can get along without any light at all." "Are you sleepy now?" inquired Irma, for the feast had ended. "A little," admitted the girl. So Electra showed her to a pretty chamber where there was a soft white bed, and waited patiently until Betsy had undressed and put on a shimmery silken night-robe that lay beside her pillow. Then the light maid bade her good night and opened the door. When she closed it after her, Betsy was in darkness. In 6 winks the little girl was fast asleep. End of chapter. Chapter 13 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 13. The Jinjin's Last Judgment. All the adventurers were reunited next morning, when they were brought from various palaces to the residence of Tititi-Hoochoo and ushered into the great hall of state. As before, no one was visible except our friends and their escorts until the first bell sounded. Then in a flash the room was seen to be filled with the beautiful kings and queens of the land. The second bell marked the appearance in the throne of the mighty Jinjin, whose handsome countenance was as composed and expressionless as ever. All bowed low to the ruler. Their voices softly murmured, "We greet the private citizen, mightiest of rulers, whose word is law, and whose law is just." Tititi-Hoochoo bowed in acknowledgment. Then, looking around the brilliant assemblage and at the little group of adventurers before him, he said, "An unusual thing has happened. Inhabitants of other lands than ours, who are different from ourselves in many ways, have been thrust upon us through the forbidden tube, which one of our people foolishly made years ago, and was properly punished for his folly. But these strangers had no desire to come here, and were wickedly thrust into the tube by a cruel king on the other side of the world, named Ruggedo. This king is an immortal, but he is not good. His magic powers hurt mankind more than they benefit them. Because he had unjustly kept the Shaggy Man's brother a prisoner, this little band of honest people, consisting of both mortals and immortals, determined to conquer Ruggedo and to punish him. Fearing they might succeed in this, the Gnome King misled them so that they fell into the tube. Now, this same Ruggedo has been warned by me many times that if ever he used this forbidden tube in any way he would be severely punished. I find, by referring to the fairy records, that this king's servant, a gnome named Kaliko, begged his master not to do such a wrong act as to drop these people into the tube and send them tumbling into our country. But Ruggedo defied me and my orders. Therefore these strangers are innocent of any wrong. It is only Ruggedo who deserves punishment, and I will punish him." He paused a moment, and then continued in the same cold, merciless voice. "These strangers must return through the tube to their own side of the world, but I will make their fall more easy and pleasant than it was before. Also I shall send with them an instrument of vengeance, who in my name will drive Ruggedo from his underground caverns, take away his magic powers, and make him a homeless wanderer on the face of the earth, a place he detests." There was a little murmur of horror from the kings and queens at the severity of this punishment, but no one uttered a protest, for all realized that the sentence was just. "In selecting my instrument of vengeance," went on Tititi-Hoochoo, "I have realized that this will be an unpleasant mission. Therefore no one of us who is blameless should be forced to undertake it. In this wonderful land it is seldom one is guilty of wrong, even in the slightest degree, and on examining the records I found no king or queen had erred, nor had any among their followers or servants done any wrong. But finally I came to the dragon family, which we highly respect, and then it was that I discovered the error of Quacks. Quacks, as you well know, is a young dragon who has not yet acquired the wisdom of his race. Because of this lack, he has been disrespectful toward his most ancient ancestor, the original dragon, telling him once to mind his own business, and again saying that the ancient one had grown foolish with age. We are aware that dragons are not the same as fairies, and cannot be altogether guided by our laws. Yet such disrespect as Quacks has shown should not be unnoticed by us. Therefore I have selected Quacks as my royal instrument of vengeance, and he shall go through the tube with these people, and inflict upon Ruggedo the punishment I have decreed." All had listened quietly to this speech, and now the kings and queens bowed gravely to signify their approval of the Jinjin's judgment. Tititi-Hoochoo turned to Tubekins. "I command you," said he, "to escort these strangers to the tube, and see that they all enter it." The king of the tube, who had first discovered our friends and brought them to the private citizen, stepped forward and bowed. As he did so, the Jinjin and all the kings and queens suddenly disappeared, and only Tubekins remained visible. "All right," said Betsy, with a sigh. "I don't mind going back so very much, 'cause the Jinjin promised to make it easy for us." Indeed, Queen Anne and her officers were the only ones who looked solemn, and seemed to fear the return journey. One thing that bothered Anne was her failure to conquer this land of Tititi-Hoochoo. As they followed their guide through the gardens to the mouth of the tube, she said to Shaggy, "How can I conquer the world if I go away and leave this rich country unconquered?" "You can't," he replied. "Don't ask me why, please, for if you don't know, I can't inform you." "Why not?" said Anne, but Shaggy paid no attention to the question. This end of the tube had a silver rim, and around it was a gold railing, to which was attached a sign that read, "If you are out, stay there. If you are in, don't come out." On a little silver plate just inside the tube was engraved the words, "Burrowed and built by Hirgargo the magician, in the year of the world 196-25478, for his own exclusive uses." "He was some builder, I must say," remarked Betsy, when she had read the inscription. "But if he had known about that star, I guess he'd have spent his time playing solitaire." "Well, what are we waiting for?" inquired Shaggy, who was impatient to start. "Quacks," replied Tubekins, "but I think I hear him coming." "Is the young dragon invisible?" asked Anne, who had never seen a live dragon and was a little fearful of meeting one. "No, indeed," replied the king of the tube. "You'll see him in a minute, but before you part company I'm sure you'll wish he was invisible." "Is he dangerous, then?" questioned Files. "Oh, not at all, but Quacks tires me dreadfully," said Tubekins, "and I prefer his room to his company." At that instant a scraping sound was heard, drawing nearer and nearer until from between two big bushes appeared a huge dragon, who approached the party, nodded his head, and said, "Good morning." Had Quacks been at all bashful, I am sure he would have felt uncomfortable at the astonished stare of every eye in the group, except Tubekins, of course, who was not astonished because he had seen Quacks so often. Betsy had thought a young dragon must be a small dragon, yet here was one so enormous that the girl decided he must be full grown, if not overgrown. His body was a lovely sky blue in color, and it was thickly set with glittering silver scales, each one as big as a serving tray. Around his neck was a pink ribbon with a bow just under his left ear, and below the ribbon appeared a chain of pearls to which was attached a golden locket, about as large around as the end of a bass drum. This locket was set with many large and beautiful jewels. The head and face of Quox were not especially ugly, when you consider that he was a dragon, but his eyes were so large that it took him a long time to wink, and his teeth seemed very sharp and terrible when they showed, which they did whenever the beast smiled. Also his nostrils were quite large and wide, and those who stood near him were liable to smell brimstone, especially when he breathed out fire, as it is the nature of dragons to do. In the end of his long tail was attached a big electric light. Perhaps the most singular thing about the dragon's appearance at this time was the fact that he had a row of seats attached to his back, one seat for each member of the party. These seats were double, with curved backs, so that two could sit in them, and there were 12 of these double seats, all strapped firmly around the dragon's thick body and placed one behind the other, in a row that extended from his shoulders nearly to his tail. "Aha!" exclaimed Tubekins. "I see that Tititi-Hoochoo has transformed Quox into a carryall." "I'm glad of that," said Betsy. "I hope, Mr. Dragon, you won't mind our riding on your back."
"Not a bit," replied Quox. "I'm in disgrace just now, you know, and the only way to redeem my good name is to obey the orders of the Jinjin. If he makes me a beast of burden, it is only a part of my punishment, and I must bear it like a dragon. I don't blame you people at all, and I hope you'll enjoy the ride. Hop on, please. All aboard for the other side of the world."
Silently they took their places. Hank sat in the front seat with Betsy, so that he could rest his front hoofs upon the dragon's head. Behind them were Shaggy and Polychrome, then Files and the Princess, and Queen Ann and Tik-Tok. The officers rode in the rear seats. When all had mounted to their places, the dragon looked very like one of those sightseeing wagons so common in big cities, only he had legs instead of wheels.
"All ready?"
asked Quox, and when they said they were, he crawled to the mouth of the tube and put his head in. "Goodbye, and good luck to you," called Tubekins, but no one thought to reply, because just then the dragon slid his great body into the tube, and the journey to the other side of the world had begun. At first they went so fast that they could scarcely catch their breaths, but presently Quox slowed up and said with a sort of cackling laugh,
"My scales, but that is some tumble. I think I shall take it easy and fall slower. I'm likely to get dizzy. Is it very far to the other side of the world?"
"Haven't you ever been through this tube before?" inquired Shaggy.
"Never. Nor has anyone else in our country, at least not since I was born."
"How long ago was that?"
asked Betsy.
"That I was born? Oh, not very long ago. I'm only a mere child. If I had not been sent on this journey, I would have celebrated my 3056th birthday next Thursday. Mother was going to make me a birthday cake with 3056 candles on it. But now, of course, there will be no celebration, for I fear I shall not get home in time for it."
3056 years!" cried Betsy. "Why, I had no idea anything could live that long."
"My respected ancestor, whom I would call a Stupid old humbug, if I had not reformed, is so old that I am a mere baby compared with him," said Quacks. "He dates from the beginning of the world, and insists on telling us stories of things that happened 50,000 years ago, which are of no interest at all to youngsters like me. In fact, Grandpa isn't up to date. He lives altogether in the past, so I can't see any good reason for his being alive today. Are you people able to see your way, or shall I turn on more light?"
"Oh, we can see very nicely, thank you. Only there's nothing to see but ourselves," answered Betsy. This was true. The dragon's big eyes were like headlights on an automobile, and illuminated the tube very far ahead of them. Also, he curled his tail upwards so that the electric light on the end of it enabled them to see one another quite clearly. But the tube itself was only dark metal, smooth as glass, but exactly the same from one of its ends to the other. Therefore there was no scenery of interest to beguile the journey. They were now falling so gently that the trip was proving entirely comfortable, as the Jin had promised it would be. But this meant a longer journey, and the only way they could make time pass was to engage in conversation. The dragon seemed a willing and persistent talker, and he was of so much interest to them that they encouraged him to chatter. His voice was a little gruff, but not unpleasant when one became used to it.
"My only fear," said he presently, "is that this constant sliding over the surface of the tube will dull my claws. You see, this hole isn't straight down, but on a steep slant, and so instead of tumbling freely through the air, I must skate along the tube. Fortunately, there is a file in my tool kit, and if my claws get dull, they can be sharpened again."
"Why do you want sharp claws?" asked Betsy.
"They are my natural weapons, and you must not forget I have been sent to conquer Ruggedo."
"Oh, you needn't mind about that," remarked Queen Anne in her most haughty manner. "For when we get to Ruggedo, I and my invincible army can conquer him without your assistance."
"Very good," returned the dragon cheerfully. "That will save me a lot of bother, if you succeed. But I think I shall file my claws just the same."
He gave a long sigh as he said this, and a sheet of flame several feet in length shot from his mouth. Betsy shuddered, and Hank said, "Hee-haw!" while some of the officers screamed in terror. But the dragon did not notice that he had done anything unusual. "Is there fire inside of you?" asked Shaggy.
"Of course," answered Quacks. "What sort of a dragon would I be if my fire went out?"
"What keeps it going?" Betsy inquired.
"I've no idea. I only know it's there," said Quacks. "The fire keeps me alive, and enables me to move, also to think and speak."
"Ah, you are very much like myself," said Tik-Tok. "The only difference is that I move by clockwork, while you move by fire."
"I don't see a particle of difference between us, I must confess," retorted Quacks gruffly. "You are not a live thing. You're a dummy."
"But I can do things, you must admit," said Tik-Tok.
"Yes, when you are wound up," sneered the dragon. "But if you run down, you are helpless."
"What would happen to you, Quacks, if you ran out of gasoline?" inquired Shaggy, who did not like this attack upon his friend.
"I don't use gasoline."
"Well, suppose you ran out of fire?"
"What's the use of supposing that?" asked Quacks. "My great-great-great-grandfather has lived since the world began, and he has never once ran out of fire to keep him going. but I will confide to you that as he gets older he shows more smoke and less fire. As for Tik-Tok, he's well enough in his way, but he's merely copper, and the metal monarch knows copper through and through. I wouldn't be surprised if Ruggedo melted Tik-Tok in one of his furnaces and made copper pennies of him.
In that case, I would still keep going, remarked Tik-Tok calmly. Pennies do, said Betsy regretfully. This is all nonsense, said the Queen with irritation. Tik-Tok is my great army, all but the officers, and I believe he will be able to conquer Ruggedo with ease. What do you think, Polychrome? You might let him try, answered the Rainbow's daughter with her sweet ringing laugh that sounded like the tinkling of tiny bells. And if Tik-Tok fails, you have still the big fire-breathing dragon to fall back on.
Ah, said the dragon, another sheet of flame gushing from his mouth and nostrils. It's a wise little girl, this Polychrome. Anyone would know she is a fairy.
End of chapter. Chapter 14 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 14. The Long-Eared Hearer Learns by Listening. During this time Ruggedo, the metal monarch and king of the gnomes, was trying to amuse himself in his splendid jeweled cavern. It was hard work for Ruggedo to find amusement today, for all the gnomes were behaving well, and there was no one to scold or to punish. The king had thrown his scepter at Kaliko 6 times without hitting him once. Not that Kaliko had done anything wrong. On the contrary, he had obeyed the king in every way but one. He would not stand still when commanded to do so, and let the heavy scepter strike him. We can hardly blame Kaliko for this, and even the cruel Ruggedo forgave him, for he knew very well that if he mashed his royal chamberlain, he could never find another so intelligent and obedient. Kaliko could make the gnomes work when their king could not, for the gnomes hated Ruggedo, and there were so many thousands of the quaint little underground people that they could easily have rebelled and defied the king had they dared to do so. Sometimes, when Ruggedo abused them worse than usual, they grew sullen and threw down their hammers and picks. Then, however hard the king scolded or whipped them, they would not work until Kaliko came and begged them to. For Kaliko was one of themselves, and was as much abused by the king as any gnome in the vast series of caverns. But today all the little people were working industriously at their tasks, and Ruggedo, having nothing to do, was greatly bored. He sent for the long-eared hearer, and asked him to listen carefully and report what was going on in the big world. "It seems," said the hearer, after listening for a while, "that the women in America have clubs."
"Are there spikes in them?" asked Ruggedo, yawning.
"I cannot hear any spikes, your majesty," was the reply.
"Then their clubs are not as good as my scepter. What else do you hear?"
"There's a war."
"Bah! There's always a war. What else?"
For a time the hearer was silent, bending forward and spreading out his big ears to catch the slightest sound. Then suddenly he said, "Here is an interesting thing, your majesty. These people are arguing as to who shall conquer the metal monarch, seize his treasure, and drive him from his dominions."
"What people?"
demanded Ruggedo, sitting up straight in his throne. The ones you threw down the hollow tube."
"Where are they now?"
"In the same tube, and coming back this way," said the hearer. Ruggedo got out of his throne and began to pace up and down the cavern.
"I wonder what can be done to stop them,"
he mused. "Well," said the hearer, "if you could turn the tube upside down, they would be falling the other way, your Majesty." Ruggedo glared at him wickedly, for it was impossible to turn the tube upside down, and he believed the hearer was slyly poking fun at him. Presently he asked, "How far away are these people now?" "About 9,306 miles, 17 furlongs, 8 feet and 4 inches, as nearly as I can judge from the sound of their voices," replied the hearer.
"Aha! Then it will be some time before they arrive," said Ruggedo. "And when they get here I shall be ready to receive them."
He rushed to his gong and pounded upon it so fiercely that Kaliko came bounding into the cavern with one shoe off and one shoe on, for he was just dressing himself after a swim in the hot bubbling lake of the underground kingdom.
"Kaliko, these invaders whom we threw down the tube are coming back again," he exclaimed.
"I thought they would," said the royal chamberlain, pulling on the other shoe. "Tititi-Hoochoo would not allow them to remain in his kingdom, of course, and so I've been expecting them back for some time. That was a very foolish action of yours, Rug."
"What, to throw them down the tube?"
"Yes, Tititi-Hoochoo has forbidden us to throw even rubbish into the tube."
"Pooh! What do I care for the Jin-Jin?" asked Ruggedo scornfully. "He never leaves his own kingdom, which is on the other side of the world."
"True, but he might send someone through the tube to punish you," suggested Kaliko.
"I'd like to see him do it. Who could conquer my thousands of gnomes?"
"Why, they've been conquered before, if I remember aright," answered Kaliko with a grin. "Once I saw you running from a little girl named Dorothy and her friends, as if you were really afraid."
"Well, I was afraid that time," admitted the Gnome King, with a deep sigh, "for Dorothy had a yellow hen that laid eggs."
The king shuddered as he said eggs, and Kaliko also shuddered, and so did the long-eared hearer, for eggs are the only things that the gnomes greatly dread. The reason for this is that eggs belong on the earth's surface, where birds and fowl of all sorts live, and there is something about a hen's egg especially that fills a gnome with horror. If by chance the inside of an egg touches one of these underground people, he withers up and blows away, and that is the end of him, unless he manages quickly to speak a magical word which only a few of the gnomes know. Therefore Ruggedo and his followers had very good cause to shudder at the mere mention of eggs.
"But Dorothy," said the king, "is not with this band of invaders, nor is the yellow hen. As for Tititi-Hoochoo, he has no means of knowing that we are afraid of eggs."
"You mustn't be too sure of that," Kaliko warned him. "Tititi-Hoochoo knows a great many things, being a fairy, and his powers are far superior to any we can boast." Ruggedo shrugged impatiently and turned to the hearer.
"Listen," said he, "and tell me if you hear any eggs coming through the tube."
The long-eared one listened, and then shook his head. But Kaliko laughed at the king. "No one can hear an egg, your Majesty," said he. "The only way to discover the truth is to look through the magic spyglass."
"That's it!" cried the king. "Why didn't I think of it before? Look at once, Kaliko."
So Kaliko went to the spyglass, and by uttering a mumbled charm he caused the other end of it to twist around, so that it pointed down the opening of the tube. Then he put his eye to the glass, and was able to gaze along all the turns and windings of the magic spyglass, and then deep into the tube, to where our friends were at that time falling. "Dear me!" he exclaimed. "Here comes a dragon!"
A big one?
asked Ruggedo. "A monster! He has an electric light on the end of his tail, so I can see him very plainly, and the other people are all riding upon his back."
How about the eggs? inquired the king.
Kaliko looked again. "I can see no eggs at all," said he, "but I imagine that the dragon is as dangerous as eggs. Probably Tititi Hoochoo has sent him here to punish you for dropping those strangers into the forbidden tube. I warned you not to do it, your majesty." This news made the Gnome King anxious. For a few minutes he paced up and down, stroking his long beard, and thinking with all his might. After this he turned to Kaliko and said,
All the harm a dragon can do is to scratch with his claws and bite with his teeth.
"That is not all, but it's quite enough," returned Kaliko earnestly. "On the other hand, no one can hurt a dragon, because he's the toughest creature alive. One flop of his huge tail could smash 100 gnomes to pancakes, and with teeth and claws he could tear even you or me into small bits, so that it would be almost impossible to put us together again. Once, a few hundred years ago, while wandering through some deserted caverns, I came upon a small piece of a gnome lying on the rocky floor. I asked the piece of gnome what had happened to it. Fortunately, the mouth was a part of this piece, the mouth and the left eye, so it was able to tell me that a fierce dragon was the cause. It had attacked the poor gnome and scattered him in every direction, and as there was no friend near to collect his pieces and put him together, they had been separated for a great many years. So you see, your majesty, it is not in good taste to sneer at a dragon." The king had listened attentively to Kaliko. Said he,
It will only be necessary to chain this dragon, which Tititi Hoochoo has sent here, in order to prevent his reaching us with his claws and teeth.
"He also breathes flames," Kaliko reminded him.
My gnomes are not afraid of fire, nor am I," said Ruggedo.
"Well, how about the army of Oogaboo?"
16 cowardly officers and Tik-Tok. Why, I could defeat them single-handed, but I won't try to. I'll summon my army of gnomes to drive the invaders out of my territory, and if we catch any of them, I intend to stick needles into them until they hop with pain."
"I hope you won't hurt any of the girls," said Kaliko.
"I'll hurt 'em all!" roared the angry metal monarch. "And that braying mule I'll make into hoof soup, and feed it to my gnomes, that it may add to their strength."
"Why not be good to the strangers and release your prisoner, the Shaggy Man's brother?" suggested Kaliko.
"Never!"
"It may save you a lot of annoyance, and you don't want the ugly one."
"I don't want him, that's true, but I won't allow anybody to order me around. I'm king of the gnomes, and I'm the metal monarch, and I shall do as I please, and what I please, and when I please."
With this speech, Ruggedo threw his scepter at Kaliko's head, aiming it so well that the royal chamberlain had to fall flat upon the floor in order to escape it. But the hearer did not see the scepter coming, and it swept past his head so closely that it broke off the tip of one of his long ears. He gave a dreadful yell that quite startled Ruggedo, and the king was sorry for the accident because those long ears of the hearer were really valuable to him. So the Gnome King forgot to be angry with Kaliko, and ordered his chamberlain to summon General Guph and the army of gnomes and have them properly armed. They were then to march to the mouth of the tube, where they could seize the travelers as soon as they appeared. End of chapter.
Chapter 15 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 15. The Dragon Defies Danger. Although the journey through the tube was longer this time than before, it was so much more comfortable that none of our friends minded it at all. They talked together most of the time, and as they found the dragon good-natured and fond of the sound of his own voice, they soon became well acquainted with him and accepted him as a companion. "You see," said Shaggy in his frank way, "Quacks is on our side, and therefore the dragon is a good fellow. If he happened to be an enemy instead of a friend, I am sure I should dislike him very much, for his breath smells of brimstone. He is very conceited, and he is so strong and fierce that he would prove a dangerous foe." "Yes, indeed," returned Quacks, who had listened to this speech with pleasure. "I suppose I am about as terrible as any living thing. I am glad you find me conceited, for that proves I know my good qualities. As for my breath smelling of brimstone, I really can't help it, and I once met a man whose breath smelled of onions, which I consider far worse." "I don't," said Betsy. "I love onions." "And I love brimstone," declared the dragon. "So don't let us quarrel over one another's peculiarities." Saying this, he breathed a long breath and shot a flame 50 feet from his mouth. The brimstone made Betsy cough, but she remembered about the onions and said nothing. They had no idea how far they had gone through the center of the earth, nor when to expect the trip to end. At one time the little girl remarked, "I wonder when we'll reach the bottom of this hole. And isn't it funny, Shaggy Man, that what is the bottom to us now was the top when we fell the other way?" "What puzzles me," said Files, "is that we are able to fall both ways." "That," announced Tik-Tok, "is because the world is round." "Exactly," responded Shaggy. "The machinery in your head is in fine working order, Tik-Tok. You know, Betsy, that there is such a thing as the attraction of gravitation, which draws everything toward the center of the earth. That is why we fall out of bed, and why everything clings to the surface of the earth." "Then why doesn't everyone go down to the center of the earth?" inquired the little girl. "I was afraid you were going to ask me that," replied Shaggy in a sad tone. "The reason, my dear, is that the earth is so solid that other solid things can't get through it. But when there's a hole, as there is in this case, we drop right down to the center of the world." "Why don't we stop there?" asked Betsy. "Because we go so fast that we acquire speed enough to carry us right up to the other end." "I don't understand that, and it makes my head ache to try to figure it out," she said after some thought. "One thing draws us to the center, and another thing pushes us away from it. But—" "Don't ask me why, please," interrupted the Shaggy Man. "If you can't understand it, let it go at that." "Do you understand it?" she inquired. "All the magic isn't in Fairyland," he said gravely. "There's lots of magic in all nature, and you may see it as well in the United States, where you and I once lived, as you can here." "I never did," she replied. "Because you were so used to it all that you didn't realize it was magic. Is anything more wonderful than to see a flower grow and blossom, or to get light out of the electricity in the air? The cows that manufacture milk for us must have machinery fully as remarkable as that in Tik-Tok's copper body. And perhaps you've noticed that—" And then, before Shaggy could finish his speech, the strong light of day suddenly broke upon them, grew brighter, and completely enveloped them. The dragon's claws no longer scraped against the metal tube, for he shot into the open air 100 feet or more, and sailed so far away from the slanting hole that when he landed it was on the peak of a mountain and just over the entrance to the many underground caverns of the Gnome King. Some of the officers tumbled off their seats when Quacks struck the ground, but most of the dragon's passengers only felt a slight jar. All were glad to be on solid earth again, and they at once dismounted and began to look about them. Queerly enough, as soon as they had left the dragon, the seats that were strapped to the monster's back disappeared, and this probably happened because there was no further use for them, and because Quacks looked far more dignified in just his silver scales. Of course, he still wore the 40 yards of ribbon around his neck, as well as the great locket, but these only made him look dressed up, as Betty remarked. Now the army of gnomes had gathered thickly around the mouth of the tube, in order to be ready to capture the band of invaders as soon as they popped out. There were indeed hundreds of gnomes assembled, and they were led by Guff, their most famous general. But they did not expect the dragon to fly so high, and he shot out of the tube so suddenly that it took them by surprise. When the gnomes had rubbed the astonishment out of their eyes and regained their wits, they discovered the dragon quietly seated on the mountain-side far above their heads, while the other strangers were standing in a group and calmly looking down upon them. General Guff was very angry at the escape, which was no one's fault but his own. "Come down here and be captured," he shouted, waving his sword at them. "Come up here and capture us if you dare," replied Queen Anne, who was winding up the clockwork of her private soldier so he could fight more briskly. Guff's first answer was a roar of rage at the defiance. Then he turned and issued a command to his gnomes. These were all armed with sharp spears, and with one accord they raised these spears and threw them straight at their foes, so that they rushed through the air in a perfect cloud of flying weapons. Some damage might have been done had not the dragon quickly crawled before the others, his body being so big that it shielded every one of them, including Hank. The spears rattled against the silver scales of Quacks, and then fell harmlessly to the ground. They were magic spears, of course, and all straightway bounded back into the hands of those who had thrown them, but Guff could see that it was useless to repeat the attack. It was now Queen Anne's turn to attack, so the generals yelled, "Forward march!" and the colonels and majors and captains repeated the command, and the valiant army of Oogaboo, which seemed to be composed mainly of Tik-Tok, marched forward in single column toward the gnomes, while Betsy and Polychrome cheered and Hank gave a loud hee-haw, and Shaggy shouted hooray, and Queen Anne screamed, "At them, Tik-Tok, at them!" The gnomes did not await the clockwork man's attack, but in a twinkling disappeared into the underground caverns. They made a great mistake in being so hasty, for Tik-Tok had not taken a dozen of steps before he stubbed his copper toe on a rock and fell flat to the ground, where he cried, "Pick me up! Pick me up! Pick me up!" until Shaggy and False ran forward and raised him to his feet again. The dragon chuckled softly to himself as he scratched his left ear with his hind claw, but no one was paying much attention to Quacks just then. It was evident to Anne and her officers that there could be no fighting unless the enemy was present, and in order to find the enemy they must boldly enter the underground kingdom of the gnomes. So bold a step demanded a council of war. "Don't you think I'd better drop in on Ruggedo and obey the others of the Jinjin?" asked Quox. "By no means," returned Queen Anne. "We have already put the army of gnomes to flight, and all that yet remains is to force our way into those caverns and conquer the Gnome King and all his people." "That seems to me something of a job," said the dragon, closing his eyes sleepily. "But go ahead if you like, and I'll wait here for you. Don't be in any hurry on my account. To one who lives thousands of years, the delay of a few days means nothing at all, and I shall probably sleep until the time comes for me to act." Anne was provoked at this speech. "You may as well go back to Titi-Ti-Hoo-Choo now," she said, "for the Gnome King is as good as conquered already." But Quox shook his head. "No," said he, "I'll wait." End of chapter 15.